She walked into a room full of millionaires in a worn coat and cracked shoes, carrying nothing but an old phone and 31 years of patience. They looked at her the way powerful people look at someone they've already decided doesn't matter, with that particular smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The CEO leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, completely at ease, and told her to call whoever she wanted. It wouldn't change a thing. So she did. She made one call, said 3 words, and handed him the phone. What happened next silenced an entire boardroom and started unraveling an empire that had been built on a secret no one was supposed to find. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Halston Tower was the kind of room that made men feel important just by sitting in it. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 walls gave a sweeping view of the city below, a city of traffic, noise, and ordinary people who would never set foot in a place like this. Up here, though, everything was quiet. The air smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne. The table was long and dark and polished to a mirror shine, and the chairs around it were occupied by people who had built careers out of looking confident even when they weren't. Richard Halston sat at the head of the table. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver at his temples that he had let grow in deliberately because it made him look distinguished rather than old. His suit was charcoal gray and cut precisely to his frame. But he had the easy, unhurried posture of a man who had never once doubted that a room belonged to him the moment he walked into it. And this room, in this building, with his name on the outside of it, well, there was no doubt at all. Around him sat 11 other people. 6 were his own executives, the heads of legal, acquisitions, finance, development, communications, and a senior VP whose job title had changed 3 times in the last 2 years, but whose purpose remained the same, to agree with Richard and make it sound thoughtful. The other 5 were from outside, representatives of Meridian Capital, the investment group whose partnership Richard needed to close the Grayfield land acquisition. The deal had been months in the making, hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal work, environmental assessments, surveying, title research, so the paperwork sat in neat folders in front of each person at the table. We are, as of this morning, 48 hours from the cleanest land deal this city has seen in a decade, Richard was saying, his voice smooth and unhurried. He had a way of speaking that sounded casual while also sounding final, like whatever he said was simply the way things were going to be. 1,200 acres, rezoned, clean title, ready to break ground by spring. The man from Meridian Capital, a thin, careful man named Preston, who wore glasses he was always adjusting, nodded slowly. Our board is comfortable with the numbers. We'll need one last look at the environmental sign-off before we put pen to paper. You'll have it before lunch, Richard said. That was when the door opened. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. There was no raised voice, no scene. One of the building's security staff, a young man named Kevin, who had been working the front desk for 3 months and had never once seen the 42nd floor, stepped just barely into the room and caught the eye of Richard's assistant, a sharp woman named Patricia, who was seated near the door with a tablet in her lap. Patricia rose quietly and stepped out into the hall. Through the glass panel beside the door, a few of the executives could see them talking in low voices. Patricia's expression shifted, not alarmed exactly, but something close to uncertain. She came back in and bent to Richard's ear. "There's a situation at the front desk," she said quietly. "A woman walked in off the street. She's asking for you by name. Security tried to redirect her. She won't go. She says it's about the Grayfield property." Richard's expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly. "What kind of woman?" Patricia paused. Just a half second. "Elderly, she doesn't appear to be affiliated with anyone. She came in alone." Preston from Meridian raised an eyebrow. "Everything all right?" Richard's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close enough. He had a decision to make, and it took him about 4 seconds to make it. Not because he was thinking it through carefully, but because something in him found the whole situation mildly entertaining. A distraction, a small, strange story he'd be able to tell at dinner. "Bring her up," he said. Patricia blinked. "Sir?" "Bring her up. Whatever this is. Let's get it over with quickly." He looked around the table and spread his hands in a gesture that invited everyone to share his amusement. "It's probably nothing. Might as well see what the commotion is about." There were a few quiet smiles around the table. Preston adjusted his glasses and glanced at his own assistant, who gave a small, puzzled shrug. They waited. Richard poured himself a glass of water. Conversation resumed in the easy, low-key way it does when people are filling time. Talk of parking downtown, a comment about the weather, someone mentioning a restaurant that had just opened. Then the door opened again, and the room went just slightly quieter. She walked in slowly, not because she was uncertain, but because she had a deliberateness to the way she moved that made each step feel considered. She was an older black woman, 70, maybe older, though she carried herself in a way that made it hard to pin down. Her clothes were plain and worn, a dark coat that had seen many winters, a blouse beneath it that had been ironed carefully, shoes that were clean but cracked at one side. Her hair was silver and pulled back neatly. She carried a cloth bag over one arm, the kind you got at the grocery store. She looked nothing like anyone who had ever been in this room. Kevin from security stood behind her, clearly uncomfortable, not entirely sure what he was supposed to do now that he had delivered her. She stopped near the end of the table and looked at Richard. Not at the room, at him, like she had come here specifically for him and had not yet decided whether she was disappointed or not. "Mr. Halston," she said. Her voice was low and clear and steady, not loud, not soft, just steady. "That's right," Richard said, leaning back with his arms crossed loosely. "And you are?" "My name is Evelyn Carter." She said it simply. No flourish, no hesitation, no addition of anything that might have explained who she was or what she represented. Just the name, like a stone placed on a table. One of the executives, the head of acquisitions, a heavy-set man named Gary, glanced at the man beside him. The man beside him gave a barely perceptible shrug. "Evelyn?" Richard said, stretching the name out slightly, like he was getting comfortable with it. "What can I do for you this morning?" "You can stop the acquisition," she said. There it was. The room absorbed it for a beat. Then Gary let out a soft sound through his nose. Not quite a laugh, well, but the beginning of one. Someone else shifted in their seat. Preston from Meridian looked at his folder. Richard tilted his head. "Is that right?" "The Grayfield land," Evelyn said. "The 1,200 acres you're planning to sign for, you cannot proceed." "And why's that?" Richard asked. His tone was patient in the way that powerful people are patient when they're not threatened, generous almost, like he was extending her the courtesy of a response. "Because it was never legally available to be sold," she said. Silence. Then Gary did laugh, just a short, quiet one, but it was enough to break whatever tension had been building. One of the Meridian representatives smiled carefully at his water glass. Richard himself let out a breath through his nose that was halfway between amusement and exasperation. "Ma'am," said the head of legal, "like a younger man named Brett, who had been with the company 4 years and had reviewed every document related to Grayfield 3 times over. With respect, all title work on this property has been fully verified. Chain of ownership is clean. There is nothing in the record that—" "You're looking at the wrong records," Evelyn said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look at Brett like he had insulted her. She simply corrected him the way a person corrects someone who is confidently wrong. Brett opened his mouth, closed it. "The original deed," Evelyn said, "was filed in 1961. There's a clause in the original land covenant, a reverter clause tied to conditions that were never properly dissolved. The 1987 transfer, which forms the base of your current title chain, was executed without satisfying those conditions. That makes every transfer since then legally questionable. The room was very quiet now, not because anyone believed her, but because the specificity of what she had just said was unexpected. Richard was watching her with something new in his expression, not concern, not quite, but a heightened attention. He leaned forward slowly, elbows on the table. "Where are you getting this?" he asked. "From the records," she said. "Our team has been through those records," Brett said. "Extensively." "Then they weren't thorough enough," she said. That landed wrong. Brett's jaw tightened. Gary crossed his arms. Richard let a slow smile spread across his face, and it was the kind of smile that felt like a door closing. "I'll tell you what, Evelyn," he said, and his voice had taken on that particular tone. The one that was still polite, but had a blade in it, the one he used when he wanted someone to understand that the conversation was over while still appearing reasonable. "You clearly feel strongly about this, and I respect that. But we have a room full of lawyers, a team of researchers, and years of due diligence behind this deal. If there were something in those records, we would have found it." He spread his hands. "Call whoever you want," he said. "It won't change a thing." Someone at the table laughed. Not loudly. It was the polite, controlled kind of laughter that boardrooms produce, the kind that wasn't cruel so much as entirely dismissive. A sound that said, "We are not taking this seriously, and we are comfortable telling you so." Evelyn stood still. She didn't flinch. She didn't flush with embarrassment, or start explaining herself more urgently, or do any of the things that people do when they feel the ground shifting beneath them. She just stood, quiet and straight, and let the laughter settle. Then she reached into the cloth bag on her arm. She pulled out a phone. It was old, not ancient, but clearly a few generations behind whatever everyone else in the room was carrying. A plain black rectangle with a worn case. She held it in both hands, steadily, and looked down at the screen. She scrolled for a moment, found what she was looking for, and pressed call. The phone rang, and something happened in the room then, something that would have been hard to describe afterward because it wasn't a dramatic event. The laughter had faded. People had gone back to their water glasses and their folders. Richard was half-turned in his chair, already beginning to signal to Patricia that it was time to wrap this up. But at the far end of the table, in the corner seat closest to the window, an older man, mid-70s, white-haired, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned long ago to take up as little space as possible, went very slightly still. His name was Mr. Wallace. He had been brought in as a senior consultant on this deal, a man with 40 years of property law behind him, and he had said very little during the meeting. He was not the kind of man who needed to say much. But now his eyes were on Evelyn Carter, and there was something in them, not recognition, not yet, but the early flicker of it, like a word on the tip of the tongue that wouldn't quite come. He stared at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the phone in her hands, listening to it ring. And something about the name she had given, Carter, something about the way she was standing. He couldn't place it, not yet. The phone rang twice. The room, which had just begun to loosen back into its usual rhythms. Gary murmuring something to the man beside him. Preston refilling his water glass. Richard's fingers tapping once against the armrest of his chair. Held a half-breath without meaning to. On the third ring, someone at the table made a quiet remark about the time. Someone else almost smiled at it. On the fourth ring, the call connected. Evelyn raised the phone to her ear. She didn't say hello. She said, "It's me." And that was all. Just 2 words. But something about the way she said them made the conversation in the room pause again. Not because of volume, but because of tone. The woman who had stood at the end of that table with the quiet dignity of someone who had weathered a great many rooms full of people who didn't want her there. That woman was still there. but her voice had changed by a shade, softer, not weakened, warmer. Like whoever was on the other end of that call was someone she did not need to perform anything for. She listened. Her posture didn't change, still upright, still composed, but something settled in her, a subtle shift, like a door that had been slightly ajar, swinging all the way open and then holding. "They're about to sign it," she said quietly. A pause. Yes, that one. She listened again. Gary leaned toward the man beside him and said something behind his hand. The man almost laughed. Richard watched her with an expression that was still mostly amusement, but had a faint edge of something else beneath it. Not quite impatience and not quite curiosity, but something moving between the two. "This is a nice touch," Richard said, just loudly enough to be heard by the room without quite being directed at her. He was playing to the table, and the table appreciated it. Preston smiled carefully at his folder again. Brett had his pen out and was tapping it slowly against his palm. Evelyn didn't look at Richard. She was still listening. Then Richard leaned forward with his elbows on the table, and he raised his voice just enough to be heard by everyone, including her, and he said, "Who is it? The mayor? The president?" The laughter was fuller this time, more comfortable. The room had decided that this was theater. Mildly interesting theater, something to recount later, the strange morning the old woman wandered in off the street and made a phone call. And having decided that, they relaxed into it. Evelyn lowered the phone from her ear. She looked at it in her hands for one moment. Then she looked up, and her eyes found Richard, and she extended the phone toward him across the table. "Take it," she said. Richard glanced at the phone, then at her, then at the room, which was watching him with a kind of entertained expectancy. He smiled. He rose from his chair, not quickly, but with the unhurried ease of a man who was in on a joke, and walked to where she stood at the end of the table. He took the phone from her with one hand, picked the same way you'd take something from a child who had handed you a drawing they were proud of. He raised it to his ear. "Hello?" His tone was light, indulgent. This was still theater. And then the voice on the other end spoke. No one in the room could hear it. There was no speaker, no echo. Just the phone against Richard's ear and the voice coming through it. And whatever that voice said, it took only a few seconds. Maybe 8, maybe 10. The kind of exchange so brief that it shouldn't have meant anything, but it meant everything. The smile left Richard Halston's face. Not slowly, the way smiles fade when something becomes boring, but all at once, the way a light goes out. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. His hand, which had been relaxed at his side, went to grip the back of the nearest chair, just lightly. Just for a moment, like he needed to locate something solid. His color changed. It was subtle, and most people at the table didn't catch it, because they weren't looking for it. They were waiting for the punchline. But Preston, who was a careful man and had built a career out of reading rooms, noticed. He noticed the way Richard's jaw adjusted, the way his chin dropped just slightly, like weight had been placed on his shoulders from above, the way his eyes stopped moving and focused on a point somewhere past the wall. The laughter at the table hadn't died yet. It was still trailing off from the last comment, but it thinned because the man at the center of it had gone somewhere else. Richard was still standing there, still holding the phone, but he was no longer in the room. He was somewhere in the sound of that voice. He said nothing. He'd not, "I see," or "yes," or "hold on." He simply stood and listened, and when the voice stopped, he lowered the phone without ending the call. He held it at his side. The room had gone quiet. Not the focused, attentive quiet of people listening. The held, confused quiet of people who didn't understand what they were watching. Richard looked at Evelyn Carter. She was already looking at him. She had been this whole time, standing with her hands folded now in front of her, the cloth bag on her arm, watching him with an expression that was neither satisfied nor unkind. Just waiting. like she had known this moment was coming for a very long time and had made her peace with it long before she ever walked through the front door of this building. Richard said nothing to her. He didn't say anything to the room. But he didn't look at his executives or at Preston or at Brett. He turned, slowly, like a man moving through water, and walked toward the door at the far end of the boardroom. He still had the phone in his hand. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Gary looked at Brett. Brett looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the door. Richard walked through it without looking back. The room sat in a silence that felt almost physical, thick and disorienting, the way silence sounds in a place where there had just been laughter. People shifted in their chairs. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else reached for a glass and then put it down without drinking. Preston adjusted his glasses. Down at the end of the table, Evelyn Carter stood exactly where she had been standing for the last 10 minutes. She hadn't moved. She hadn't pulled up a chair or leaned against the wall or done any of the things a person does when they're waiting and feeling it. She simply stood, composed, like someone who had learned that patience was not the absence of urgency, but the decision to let urgency stop running you. In the corner by the window, Mr. Wallace hadn't moved either. But his stillness was a different kind, the stillness of a man whose mind was moving very fast in a direction he wasn't sure he wanted to go. His eyes were on Evelyn, had been since before the call. The name, the way she was standing, the coat, the bag, the worn shoes, the steadiness. Something in the back of his memory was pulling at him, pulling hard now. Carter. He knew that name. He had known it a long time ago, in a context that had been carefully, deliberately, systematically buried. He had been a young lawyer then, junior at a firm that no longer existed, working on deals he had not fully understood at the time, and had told himself, in the years since, that he had understood even less than he'd thought. It was easier that way, to let the understanding stay shallow. But the name, Carter. He stared at the old woman at the end of the table. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the door through which Richard Halston had just walked, holding a phone that belonged to her, with a voice in his ear that had done something to him in 8 or 10 seconds that 40 years of business and negotiation had never done. The room began to stir. Murmurs started up. Gary put his palms flat on the table like he was about to say something authoritative, but hadn't yet decided what it was. Two of the Meridian representatives were exchanging a look that meant their firm's lawyers were going to have a very busy afternoon. Brett, who had been quiet since Evelyn had corrected him on the records, was looking at her differently now. Not with respect, not yet, but with the careful, recalibrating look of someone who has been confident in their position and has just seen that confidence develop a crack. "All right," Gary said finally, filling the silence with his voice, the way people sometimes do, just to have something in their hands. "I'm sure Richard just stepped out to handle something. Let's give it a few minutes." Nobody responded to this. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed a response. It was just something to say. Evelyn turned her head slightly and looked at Mr. Wallace. He didn't look away fast enough. Their eyes met. For a second, just a second, something passed between them. Not words, not explanation, just recognition, moving in one direction, from her eyes to his, and the quiet, certain understanding on her part that he was almost there, almost to the place in his memory where it was going to become impossible to unsee. He looked down at the table. His hands, which had been resting flat in front of him, turned slightly so that his fingers curled inward, like he was trying to hold something or trying to keep something in. Evelyn looked away. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, through the hallway with its framed architectural renderings and its soft corporate lighting, Richard Halston stood near the window at the end of the corridor. He was alone. His jacket was still perfectly pressed, his posture still broadly upright, but one hand was pressed flat against the glass of the window, and he was looking out at the city 42 floors below. He was still holding the phone. He said something. Quietly, too quietly to hear through the glass. His lips moved. Then he was listening again, and his head bowed just slightly, and his shoulders, which had held all morning the relaxed confidence of a man who had never once been surprised by a negotiation, curved inward just a fraction, just enough to see. Inside the boardroom, Daniel Archer had not said a single word in the last 15 minutes. Daniel was 29 years old, a junior legal analyst who had been brought onto the Grayfield acquisition 6 weeks ago to assist with document review. He was good at his job, methodical, detail-oriented. You're the kind of person who read footnotes. But he was junior enough that no one in this room had looked at him directly since the meeting began. He was there to be useful and invisible, and he had been both, right up until Evelyn Carter had walked through the door. He had been watching her since she came in, watching the room's reaction to her, watching the shift in Richard's face when he held that phone to his ear. Now, while the room murmured and Gary made noises about waiting and Preston quietly texted someone beneath the table, Daniel had his tablet angled away from the others and his fingers moving carefully across the screen. He was pulling records. Not the standard title chain. He had read through those 3 times during his weeks on the acquisition. He was going further back. Older filings. To pre-digital records that had been scanned and archived in a county database that most people didn't know existed and fewer knew how to search. He typed, Grayfield parcel. He tried variations of the address. He tried the coordinates. He filtered by decade. Then he tried Carter and found something. He stared at the screen. His expression didn't change. Not visibly, not in a room where someone might notice, but his breathing changed slightly. His fingers went still. The document on the screen was old. The scan was imperfect, warped at the edges, slightly overexposed in the center, but the text was legible. A deed, a transfer, dated 1961, exactly as Evelyn had said, and the name at the top of it, the name in the line marked original owner of record, was Carter Holdings, Incorporated. He scrolled down, and his eyes moved across the lines of old legal language that had been written carefully and deliberately to say something that most people would only understand if they were reading it with the right question in mind. And there, buried in the 3rd page of a document that had been filed 63 years ago and apparently never opened again, was a clause. He read it twice. Then he read it a 3rd time. He set the tablet down, face up, on the table in front of him. The document still glowing on the screen. He looked up at Evelyn Carter, who was standing calmly at the end of the room. She was not looking at him. But something told him, some instinct sharpened by weeks of reading documents where the truth was always 3 pages deeper than where people stopped looking, that she already knew he had found it. And she had known he would. The boardroom had a particular kind of silence now, the kind that follows something no one can explain and no one wants to be the first to address. The laughter was long gone. In its place was the uncomfortable stillness of 11 people sitting around a table that had, in the span of 15 minutes, stopped feeling like a place where they were in control. Gary cleared his throat. He had done this 3 times in the last 5 minutes, each time as a prelude to saying something that never quite materialized. He was a man built for momentum, for deal flow and forward motion, and the absence of both had left him visibly restless. He straightened the folder in front of him. He looked at the door. He looked at Patricia, who was still seated near the wall with her tablet in her lap and her expression carefully neutral. "Someone should check on Richard," he said finally. "He's on a call," Patricia said, which wasn't exactly what she knew, but was close enough to what she suspected, and it had the effect of settling the room for another minute or so. Preston, from Meridian, had put away his pen. He was sitting very still, which was different from his earlier stillness. This one had a watchfulness to it, the posture of a man running calculations he hadn't expected to be running today. His associate had typed something into a phone and was waiting for a response. Evelyn Carter had not moved. She was still standing near the end of the table, her cloth bag over her arm, her hands folded in front of her. Yet the room moved around her the way water moves around a stone, accommodating her presence without acknowledging it. No one had offered her a chair. No one had asked her to leave either, though two of the executives had exchanged a glance that said the thought had crossed their minds. Brett, the head of legal, had his laptop open in front of him now. He was typing steadily, pulling something up, cross-referencing something else. His posture said that he was working. His expression said that he was rattled and didn't want to be. At the far end of the table, in his corner seat by the window, Mr. Wallace had not looked away from Evelyn Carter for more than a few seconds at a stretch since Richard had left the room. He was 74 years old. He had been a property lawyer for 40 years before retiring to consulting. And in that time, he had developed the practiced ability to keep his face from showing what his mind was doing. It had served him well across decades of negotiations, depositions, and conversations with powerful people who were trying to read him. He deployed it now automatically as a reflex. But underneath it, his mind was doing something it hadn't done in a very long time. It was going backward. The name Carter, the woman's age, the way she had cited the 1961 deed without notes, without a document in front of her, without hesitation, like she had recited it so many times in private that it had become something she carried the way other people carry a birth date or a childhood address. And the phrase she had used, reverter clause, the original land covenant. He hadn't heard those specific words applied to that specific piece of land in over 30 years. He pressed his fingertips together beneath the table, out of sight. 32 years ago, he had been a junior associate at a firm called Pierce & Holloway. He had been 29, Daniel Archer's age, he realized distantly, nearly to the year. And he had worked on a property transfer, a large one. 1,200 acres just outside the city, on the eastern side of the county line, in an area that was mostly farmland and river access, and hadn't yet become what it would eventually become. The transfer had been complicated. There had been a holding company on the original deed, a black-owned enterprise, substantial and growing, that had built its position in commercial real estate over the better part of 2 decades. And he had not been the lead on the deal. He had been junior. He had been asked to review a specific subset of documents, specifically those related to a clause in the original covenant, and to confirm that the clause had been properly discharged. He had confirmed it. The folder had gone upstairs. The deal had closed. And the holding company, the one whose name had been at the top of the original deed, had, within the following 18 months, ceased to exist. He had noted this at the time, had told himself it was coincidence, or market forces, or simply the way of things, had moved on to the next assignment, and then the next firm, and then the next decade, Carter Holdings. He felt the name land in his chest like something dropped from a height. He looked at the woman at the end of the table. 70, he guessed. 72, maybe. Which would have made her, in 1987, when he was 29 and reviewing those documents, in her late 30s or early 40s. Young enough to still be building something. Old enough to have already built it. He wanted to look away. He didn't. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, down the corridor lined with framed architectural renderings of buildings that Richard's company had put up across the city, Richard Halston was still standing at the window. He was no longer pressing his hand against the glass. He was standing with both arms at his sides, the old phone held loosely in one hand, and he was speaking in a voice that someone 20 feet away would not have been able to hear, quiet and level and careful, like a man choosing every word before releasing it. The voice on the other end was doing most of the talking. Richard nodded once, then a second time. His expression was not the expression of a man receiving bad news. It was more unsettling than that. It was the expression of a man receiving information he had somewhere, in a part of himself he had never examined closely, expected. Like the bill arriving for a meal he had eaten so long ago, he had convinced himself he would never be asked to pay. He said something short, a question, by its sound, listened to the response, said something else, shorter still. Then he ended the call. He stood at the window for another moment, looking out at the city. 42 floors below, people were walking to lunch, hailing taxis, moving through their days without any awareness of what was happening in this building. He watched them with an expression that had no name, exactly, but was somewhere between grief and the particular loneliness of realizing that something you thought was solid has been hollow the whole time. He turned and walked back toward the boardroom. Back inside, Daniel Archer had not touched the tablet since placing it face up on the table. The document was still glowing on the screen. The 1961 deed, third page, the reverter clause, Carter Holdings Incorporated, printed clearly in the owner of record line. He had angled the tablet toward himself so that the screen was visible to him and not easily readable by anyone next to him, but he had not minimized it or locked it. Some part of him was still deciding whether he was going to show it to someone or keep it to himself until he understood what it meant. He was leaning toward the latter. He was good at his job in part because he did not move until he understood what he was looking at. He looked across the table at Evelyn Carter. She was standing with the same composure she had walked in with. No tension in her shoulders, no restlessness in her hands. She didn't look like someone who was waiting for something to happen. She looked like someone who knew what was going to happen and was simply giving it the space to arrive. Daniel thought about the clause he had read. A reverter clause in a 1961 deed meant that under specific conditions that had to be formally discharged before any subsequent transfer of the property could be considered legally clean, the land reverted to the original holder. If those conditions had never been properly discharged, then every subsequent sale, every subsequent title, every subsequent acquisition built on top of that original transfer was sitting on a foundation that a good lawyer with the right documents could challenge. He picked up the tablet. He kept scrolling. The room shifted when the door opened. Richard Halston walked back in. He was still dressed the same way, still pressed, still upright. But something about him had been rearranged. It was difficult to point to exactly what. His jacket hadn't changed. His posture was only minimally different. But the room felt it immediately, the way rooms feel a change in air pressure before they can explain it. Gary stopped mid-murmur. Brett looked up from his laptop. Patricia's hands went still over her tablet. Richard walked to his chair but didn't sit down. He stood behind it, both hands resting on the top of it, and looked around the table with an expression that was composed and careful and utterly unlike the easy authority he had worn all morning. He looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. "I'd like the room cleared," he said. Nobody moved for a second. Then Gary, who had 20 years of reading Richard Halston's moods, pushed back his chair. "Richard," Preston started. "I'll have someone reach out to you this afternoon, Preston," Richard said. His voice was even, final. "We'll reschedule." Preston looked at him for a long moment. Then he gathered his folder, nodded to his associate, and stood. The Meridian team filed out first, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned that when a meeting suddenly ends, you ask questions later. Richard's own executives followed, Gary last, with a backwards glance that Richard didn't return. Brett closed his laptop, stood, hesitated. "Sir, if there's something in the records that requires—" "I'll call you," Richard said. Brett left. Patricia stood, smoothed her jacket, and looked at Richard with a question in her eyes that she did not ask out loud. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. She went to the door, closed it behind her. The room emptied. Almost. Daniel had gathered his bag and was moving toward the door with the careful unhurriedness of someone who hopes not to be noticed, his tablet tucked under his arm. He made it to within 3 feet of the door. "You can stay," Evelyn said. Daniel stopped. He turned. She was looking at him, had been looking at him, he realized, for longer than he'd been aware of. He looked at Richard. Richard's expression acknowledged him for the first time all morning, with a short nod that was neither permission nor protest. Just acknowledgement. Daniel stayed. He stood near the wall, holding his bag, and did not sit down. The boardroom was quiet. 3 people in a room built for 12, with the city spread out below them, and the air still carrying the ghost scent of the morning's coffee. Richard walked around to the front of his chair and finally sat down. Not at the head of the table this time. He had moved 2 seats toward the middle, which was a small thing and probably unconscious, but it changed the geometry of the room. He looked at Evelyn Carter. His voice, when he spoke, was low and stripped of its earlier performance. "Why now?" he said. The question sat between them. It was only 2 words. But they carried the weight of everything that had happened in this room and everything that had happened long before today, and Evelyn heard all of it. She pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the one she had been standing behind for the better part of an hour, and she sat down. She set her cloth bag on the table in front of her and folded her hands over it and looked at Richard Halston with the unhurried steadiness of a woman who has rehearsed nothing because she has had decades to simply know what she wants to say. "Because this is the moment it could be heard," she said. "Not before." Richard absorbed this. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "The Grayfield land," he said. It wasn't a question, more like a man saying aloud something he needed to hear in his own voice. "The Grayfield land," she confirmed. "You're saying we can't close the deal." "I'm saying the deal should never have been built," Evelyn said. "Not because of anything your company did specifically, but because the land was not clean when it came to you. It was not clean for the 30 years before it came to you. And the reason it was not clean goes back further than that." She reached into her cloth bag and drew out a manila folder. It was worn at the corners, the color of old paper, the kind of folder that has been opened and closed many times over many years. She placed it on the table, but did not open it. Not yet. "Carter Holdings was incorporated in 1958, she said. "My husband and I built it. We started with a single commercial property on the east side of the city, a warehouse we converted into leasable units. Within 5 years, we had 6 properties. Within 12 years, we had 41. By 1980, we had 93 properties across 3 counties, 214 employees, and assets valued at just under $40 million. She said these numbers without pride, not without feeling. There was feeling in them, deeply embedded, like something that had been pressed into the grain of the words over many years, but without performance. She was not recounting an achievement. She was establishing a fact. "The Grayfield land was our anchor," she said. "We acquired it in 1961, 1,200 acres. We plan to develop it in phases, commercial first, then mixed use, then residential. It was a 20-year vision, the kind of thing you build when you believe you're going to be around long enough to see it finished." She opened the folder. Inside were documents, old ones, photocopied and carefully organized, some of them annotated in small, neat handwriting. She slid a page across the table toward Richard. He picked it up. It was a copy of a deed. The paper quality was obvious even in reproduction, thick, formal, institutional. The date at the top read April 14th, 1961. He read it. His expression was attentive and unreadable. "In 1983, Evelyn continued, we began receiving pressure. It started small, zoning challenges, permit delays, inspections that found violations that hadn't existed the inspection before. At first, we thought it was bureaucratic difficulty, the kind of friction that any large developer encounters when they start operating at a certain scale." She paused. "Then we started finding the other things." "What other things?" Richard asked. "Competing filings. Documents submitted to the county that we hadn't authorized, with signatures that resembled ours but weren't. Challenges to our corporate standing based on procedural claims that had no foundation. A legal campaign, coordinated, designed to look like ordinary regulatory friction, but functioning like a system. Daniel at the wall had stopped pretending to be neutral. He was listening with the focused, forward-leaning attention of someone hearing a pattern he had already begun to suspect. By 1987, Evelyn said, we had been fighting on 11 legal fronts simultaneously. We were spending more on litigation than on operations. Our lenders, 3 separate banks, pulled their financing within a 6-week window. Not because we had defaulted, because they received something. Communications of some kind. We never knew exactly what. But the timing was not coincidence. She slid another document across the table. Richard picked it up. This one was a letter, also copied, also old, on the letterhead of a bank that no longer existed. The Grayfield land was transferred out of Carter Holdings in September of 1987, Evelyn said. We did not sell it willingly. We were told that an outstanding lien had been filed against the property, a lien we had no knowledge of, and that unless we satisfied it within 30 days, the land would be seized in partial payment. We could not satisfy it. We had been systematically stripped of the liquidity to do so. She closed the folder. Her hands rested on top of it, flat and still. The lien, she said, was fraudulent. The signature on the filing was a forgery. We know this now. We have known it for a long time. But knowing something and being in a position to do something about it are very different things, and for a long time the distance between those 2 points was too large to cross. Richard had set the letter down. He was looking at her now, not with the careful blankness of a man guarding his reaction, but with something raw underneath, a quality she hadn't seen in him before this moment. My father acquired the Grayfield parcel in 1994, he said. It came out quietly, like a confession or the beginning of one. Evelyn looked at him steadily. I know. He presented it to me as the cornerstone of the company's real estate division when I took over. Richard's voice was level, but the levelness was costing him something. He said it had been acquired through foreclosure, a distressed asset. He said the original owners had defaulted. They did not default, Evelyn said. The room was very quiet. He may not have known the full history, Evelyn said after a moment. Her voice was not generous exactly, but it was precise. She was saying what she believed to be true, not what would make him feel better. The mechanics of what was done to us moved through several hands. By the time your father's company acquired the property, it had already passed through 2 intermediaries, each one further from the original act, each one with a cleaner-looking chain of title. But the clause was still there, Daniel said. Both of them looked at him. He stood slightly straighter, aware that he had spoken aloud in a room he had been asked to simply observe. The reverter clause, he said, in the 1961 deed. It's if it was never properly discharged. It wasn't, Evelyn said simply. Daniel nodded slowly. He looked at his tablet, the document still open, the clause still visible. Then, every transfer since then rests on a title that was never fully clean, including the one that's sitting in those folders right now. Richard rubbed his hand across his face, a single slow movement. Then he lowered his hand and looked at the table. Who else knows this? He said. The right people, Evelyn said. The ones who needed to know before today, and the ones who needed to know as of this morning. Richard looked up sharply at that. Something moved across his face. Not quite alarm, not quite anger. The call. Yes. Who was on that phone, Evelyn? She looked at him for a moment. And then, for the first time since she had walked into this building, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a woman who carries something enormous and has carried it for so long that even speaking about it requires a kind of internal bracing. The one person, she said quietly, that you cannot ignore anymore. Before Richard could respond, the door to the boardroom opened. Kevin from security, the young man who had escorted Evelyn up from the lobby nearly an hour ago, who had been standing at a desk 3 floors below, trying to make sense of a morning that had stopped making sense. stepped just inside the doorway with the expression of someone delivering news he did not understand. "Mr. Halston," he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. There are people here, downstairs." He paused, visibly gathering himself. "Federal officials, sir. They're asking for you." The words landed in the room like a stone into still water, rings expanding outward. Richard sat very still for a moment. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket, a reflex, automatic, the gesture of a man who responds to threat by composing himself. He looked at Evelyn. She was already looking at him. Her expression held no triumph, no gloating satisfaction, no performance of any kind. Just the quiet, anchored certainty of a woman who had spent decades moving toward this moment, one careful step at a time, and had arrived exactly where she intended to. Daniel, at the wall, was looking between the two of them with the expression of a man who has just realized that what he thought was a footnote is actually the whole story. Richard moved toward the door. He stopped beside Kevin. Then he paused, and without turning all the way back, he spoke. "Don't go anywhere," he said. It wasn't clear exactly who he was addressing, both of them perhaps, or maybe just himself, a reminder spoken outward, a man anchoring himself to the present before the present changed entirely. He went out. Kevin followed, pulling the door shut behind him. The boardroom held its breath. Daniel looked at Evelyn. She was sitting with her hand still folded over the folder on the table, and she was looking at the door. And her expression in this moment, when no one powerful was watching her, when the room was just her and a young man at the wall who had thought to look deeper than the surface of the documents in front of him, was the expression of someone allowing themselves just briefly to feel the weight of what they had carried. A not broken, not relieved, not triumphant, just present. And tired in the way that people are tired when they have done something that required everything they had, and the doing of it is not yet finished, but the hardest part of the beginning is finally behind them. Daniel walked to the table. He set his tablet down in front of her, face up, the 1961 deed on the screen, the reverter clause visible. He didn't say anything. He just placed it there in front of her and stepped back. She looked at the screen. She looked at the clause, her clause, the one she had cited from memory because she had read it so many times over so many years that it had become a part of the architecture of how she thought. She looked at it on a screen, retrieved by a young man who had been given access to document systems that no one had thought to restrict because no one had expected anyone to go looking. She looked up at Daniel. "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" she asked. 6 years, he said. She nodded slowly. "Are you good at it?" "I find things," he said. She studied him for a moment, the same quality of attention she had given Richard, but warmer, recognizing something. "Yes," she said, "I imagine you do." Outside the boardroom, the sound of the elevator arriving on the 42nd floor was faint but audible, a soft mechanical exhalation. Then, voices in the corridor, low and measured and precise, with the particular cadence of people who had not come here to negotiate. The federal officials had arrived, and in the corner seat by the window, forgotten by the room and its larger drama, Mr. Wallace sat alone at the long, polished table with his hands folded and his eyes on the city below, and the name Carter Holdings pressed so firmly into the front of his memory, now that he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. He had been silent for a very long time. But silence, he understood now, in a way he should have understood 30 years ago, was its own kind of answer to a question that had never stopped being asked. They came in quietly. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the badges, not the suits, not the number of them, but the quality of their silence. 3 federal agents moved through the 42nd floor corridor, the way a change in weather moves through a room before the storm arrives. No raised voices, no theatrical announcements, no attempt to fill space with authority they did not need to perform. They had enough of the real thing. The lead agent was a woman named Special Agent Diane Holloway. She was in her mid-40s, lean and composed, with dark eyes that moved across a room the way a camera lens moves, taking everything in, settling on nothing longer than it needed to. She wore a charcoal blazer and carried a single leather case. The two agents behind her were younger, a man and a woman, both of whom moved with the practiced deference of people who understood that the most useful thing they could do in a room was be invisible until they were needed. Richard was waiting in the corridor when they stepped off the elevator. Kevin from security stood a few feet behind him, suddenly very aware of how little he understood about what was happening in this building today. Diane Holloway looked at Richard without introducing herself immediately. She gave the corridor a single measured glance, taking in the framed renderings, the soft lighting, the closed boardroom door at the far end, and then returned her gaze to him. "Mr. Halston," she said. It was not a greeting exactly, more like a confirmation. "Yes," Richard said. "I'm Special Agent Holloway, Federal Bureau of Investigation." She produced her credentials with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. "We'd like a few minutes of your time. We can do it here or somewhere more private. Your choice." "My conference room is occupied," Richard said, and then heard the strange truth of that sentence. "There's an office 2 doors down." "That works," Holloway said. They moved down the corridor. Kevin was dismissed with a look from one of the junior agents, not unkindly, just unmistakably. He went back to the elevator with the relieved posture of someone who has been told that what's happening is above his level and he can stop pretending otherwise. Inside the conference room, Richard sat across from Holloway while the 2 junior agents positioned themselves at angles that were clearly practiced, not blocking the door, not crowding the space, but present in a way that made the geometry of the room feel different than it had 5 minutes ago. Holloway set her leather case on the table, but did not open it. "Mr. Halston, I want to be straightforward with you," she said. "A federal case involving land fraud and financial manipulation, originally filed and suspended in 1989, has been formally reopened as of 72 hours ago. New evidence was submitted through proper legal channels. The evidence pertains directly to a property currently involved in an acquisition your company is attempting to close." Richard sat very still. "Grayfield." "Yes." Holloway's voice was even, not cold, just precise. "I'm not here to arrest you or to charge you with anything. I am here because your company is in possession of a disputed asset, and because the closing of the transaction you have scheduled for today would create significant legal complications that would be difficult to unwind after the fact." "The acquisition won't close today," Richard said. Holloway looked at him. "You've made that decision already." "I made it about 45 minutes ago," he said. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough. A very small recalibration. "I see." "The woman in the boardroom," Richard said. "Evelyn Carter, is she?" "Mrs. Carter has been cooperating with federal investigators for 14 months, Holloway said. "She is a cooperating witness. She is also the original legal claimant in the reopened case." 14 months. Richard absorbed this. He had thought the morning had begun with a disruption, a strange and unexpected intrusion into a deal he had spent months assembling. But the morning had been the last step in something that had been building carefully and methodically for over a year. He had been the last to know. "What happens now?" he said. "We'll need full access to your internal records related to the Grayfield property," Holloway said. "Title documents, acquisition files, any correspondence related to the original purchase. We'll also need to speak with members of your legal team." She paused. "We may also need to speak with some of your board." She said it without emphasis, but both of them understood the weight of it. Back in the boardroom, Daniel was still at the table with Evelyn when the muffled sounds of the corridor settled into a new, different kind of quiet, the quiet of a building that knows something has changed and is adjusting to it. Evelyn had not reopened her folder. She sat with her hand still resting on top of it, and she was looking at the window, at the city spread out below the glass, flat and gray and enormous. Daniel had sat down, finally, 2 chairs away from her. He had his tablet on the table in front of him, face down now. He was thinking about the reverter clause, about the signatures that hadn't matched, about the 1987 transfer and the lien and the 6-week window in which 3 separate banks had pulled their financing from Carter Holdings simultaneously. 6 weeks. Not one after the other in the ordinary way that financial decisions accumulate. 6 weeks, all 3, like something coordinated. He was very good at documents. He was very good at patterns. And the pattern he was seeing was the kind that made his chest feel tight in a way he didn't entirely understand, because it was one thing to know abstractly that systems could be weaponized against people, and another thing to sit 2 chairs away from a woman who had spent 35 years carrying the evidence of exactly how it had been done to her. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Evelyn looked at him. "The 14 months, he said, "before today. How did you know the timing was right for the federal case to be reopened now, specifically?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "Because the land was moving," she said finally. "It had sat dormant for a long time. When it went on the market again, when your company began the acquisition process, it created a legal moment, a window. Once a disputed asset changes hands, the complications multiply. But in the period between listing and closing, there's an opening." She looked at him steadily. "I had to be ready when the window came. And I had to make sure the right people were ready with me." "The federal case," Daniel said, "you assembled the evidence yourself." "Most of it," she said. "I had help near the end from people who knew how to navigate the legal process in ways I don't. But the foundation of it, the original documents, the forged signatures, the bank communications, the internal memos from the firm that handled the 1987 transfer, I found those myself, over time." "How much time?" She looked at the window again. "I started in 1991, she said. 4 years after we lost the land. I was 53 years old, and I had just finished settling the last of the debts from Carter Holdings' dissolution. Everything was gone, the properties, the employees, the accounts. My husband died the following year." A pause, just a small one. "I had time." Daniel said nothing. Sometimes nothing was the right response. "I went back to the beginning," she said. "To every document I could find. I requested records from the county, from the state archive, from federal repositories that most people don't know they have the right to petition. I was told no more times than I can remember. I was told the files didn't exist, that they'd been destroyed, that I didn't have standing. I kept going." She unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. "I am 71 years old. I have been working on this for 31 years, and I am sitting in this room today." She said it without drama, just as a fact, the most straightforward description of a line drawn between 2 points across decades of patience and work and refusal to stop. Daniel looked at her hands on the table, and then he picked up his tablet, turned it over, and opened a new file. "I found the reverter clause this morning," he said. "I can find more. If you'll tell me where to look." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the same careful steadiness it had been all morning, but something in it had changed very slightly, the way light changes in a room when a cloud passes from in front of the sun. Not dramatic, but present. "You'll want the 1986 county filings," she said, "specifically the lien registry for the Eastern District and the incorporation records for a company called Larimer Bridge Holdings. It only existed for 11 months between January and November of 1987. Daniel was already typing. In the corridor outside the conference room where Richard sat with the federal agents, the executives who had been dismissed from the boardroom an hour earlier were still on the floor, clustered near the elevator bank, speaking in low voices, checking phones with the anxious frequency of people waiting for information they know is going to arrive and don't know how bad it will be. Gary was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his mouth tight. He had been on the phone twice in the last 20 minutes, both times brief, both times leaving him looking slightly worse than before. Brett had his laptop open on a small table near the reception area and was typing steadily, pulling files, reading things with the focused urgency of a man who has realized he may have missed something important and is trying to find it before someone else points it out to him. Among them, one figure was separate. Mr. Wallace had not joined the cluster. He had left the boardroom when Richard cleared the room and had walked slowly to the far end of the corridor, where there was a small sitting area, 2 chairs, and a low table, the kind of space that existed in corporate buildings for purposes no one could quite name. He sat in one of the chairs. He had been sitting there since. He was looking at nothing. Or rather, he was looking at something that wasn't in the corridor, something behind his own eyes, in the landscape of memory that the morning had excavated and that he could no longer choose not to see. He had been 29 years old. He had been junior. He had been told that the reverter clause in the Carter Holdings deed had been satisfied by a process he hadn't been asked to fully review. He had been asked only to confirm that the relevant conditions had been met, based on documents that were presented to him already assembled, already organized, already pointing in a single direction. He had confirmed it. He had told himself then, and for the 35 years since, that he had not known, that he had been young, inexperienced, operating within a system he hadn't designed and a structure he hadn't chosen. That the people above him, the senior partners at Pierce and Holloway, the men who had assembled those documents, they were the ones who had made the decision. He had only reviewed what he was given. He had told himself this so many times, so thoroughly, that it had become a kind of truth, the kind that functions as long as you don't disturb it. He stood up from the chair. His knees ached, as they always did when he'd been sitting too long. He walked to the boardroom door and stood in front of it. He knocked once. Evelyn's voice came through the door. "Come in." He pushed it open. She was sitting at the table with the young analyst, Daniel he thought the name was, who had his tablet out and was typing something quickly. Evelyn looked at Wallace when he entered. Daniel looked up and then, reading the room, quietly gathered his things. "I'll start pulling those filings," he said to Evelyn. She nodded. He went out, pulling the door behind him. The boardroom held its old silence again, the polished table, the city through the glass, the two of them. Mr. Wallace walked to the table. He did not sit at the far end, and he did not sit at the head. He pulled out a chair that put him midway down the table from her, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to feel, however irrationally, like there was still some space between what he had done and what he was about to say. He sat down. "My name is Harold Wallace," he said. "I was a junior associate at Pierce and Holloway in 1987. Evelyn looked at him without expression. "I reviewed a subset of the documents related to the Carter Holdings transfer," he said, "specifically the covenant review, the reverter clause discharge." "I know," Evelyn said. Wallace's hands, flat on the table, pressed slightly harder against the surface. "You know. Your name is on the review certification," she said, "on page 7 of the covenant file. Harold T. Wallace, associate, dated September 3rd, 1987. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "I want to tell you that I didn't know what they were doing, that I was only—" "You were young," she said, not gently, but not cruelly either, like she was naming a fact. "Yes." "You were junior." "Yes." You reviewed what you were given and confirmed what you were told to confirm, and you went home that evening, and the next day you went into the office and worked on the next file. She looked at him steadily. Is that right? He held her gaze. It cost him something. Yes. The room was very quiet. The clause was not satisfied, Evelyn said. The documents you were given had been altered. The signatures on the discharge certification were forged. The process by which the conditions were supposed to have been met was fabricated. She paused. If you had been given the original documents, the ones that existed before someone altered them, you would have found that the clause was still active, and the transfer would not have been legally possible. Wallace's jaw tightened. I understand that now. I know you do, she said. The question is what you're going to do with that understanding. He looked at the table, then back at her. I want to give a statement to the investigators, whatever they need. They'll want everything, Evelyn said. Not just your role, the names above you, who gave you the documents, who the senior partners were, who commissioned the deal. All of it. I know. You've been sitting on this for 35 years, Mr. Wallace, she said. It was not an accusation, but it was not soft either. You are a key witness. The investigators will want to understand why you're coming forward now and not before. He was quiet for a moment. Because I couldn't place you when you walked into this room. And then I could. And I realized that you had never stopped. He looked at her. 35 years, and you never stopped. And I realized I had been measuring my silence against the difficulty of speaking up, when I should have been measuring it against what my silence cost someone else. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. There is an agent named Holloway, she said finally. Down the corridor. When she's finished with Mr. Halston, you should ask to speak with her. Wallace nodded. He rose from his chair. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. Mr. Wallace, he turned. It took courage, she said, coming in here. It would have been easier to sit in that chair down the corridor and stay quiet. She paused. I'm not telling you it's enough, but I'm telling you it's something. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he went out. Daniel had found the Larimer Bridge Holdings records in 11 minutes. It was not because he was extraordinary at what he did, though he was, but because Evelyn had known exactly where to tell him to look, which meant that the 11 minutes was mostly the time it took to navigate the county's archive interface and pull the scans. The records themselves told their story without ambiguity once you had the right question. Larimer Bridge Holdings had been incorporated on January 14, 1987. Its stated purpose was commercial property management. Its registered agent was a man named Philip Crane, who had also been a senior partner at Pierce & Holloway. The company had a single significant transaction on record, the acquisition of the forfeited lien on the Carter Holdings Grayfield parcel, which it had purchased from a third-party debt collector on February 3rd, 3 weeks after Larimer Bridge was incorporated. The lien itself had been filed in December of 1986, filed by a company called Eastmere Development, which, when Daniel pulled its registration, had been incorporated in November of 1986. 1 month before the lien was filed, Eastmere's registered agent, also Philip Crane. Daniel sat back in the small office he had borrowed, a spare room down the corridor from the boardroom, someone's unoccupied workspace, neat and anonymous. He looked at the screen. Then he opened a new search and typed the name Philip Crane alongside the names of the current board members of Halston Development Group. He found 2 connections immediately. The first was indirect, a shared investment vehicle, a real estate fund from the mid-90s, that listed Philip Crane as a founding partner alongside a man named Thomas Birch, who currently sat on Halston's board as an independent director. The second was less indirect, A man named Gerard Foss, currently serving as Halston's chief operating officer and a board member for 9 years, had been an associate at Pierce and Holloway in the late 80s. His start date at the firm was 1985. He had left in 1990. He had been there during the Carter Holdings transfer. Daniel stared at this for a moment. Then he stood up, took his tablet, and walked back toward the boardroom. He knocked, opened the door. Evelyn was still at the table, still with her folder, now with a legal pad in front of her on which she had written something in her small, neat hand. "Gerard Foss," Daniel said. She looked up, and something in her expression confirmed it. Not surprise, but the quiet acknowledgement of a fact that had been waiting to be named. "He was junior at Pierce and Holloway when the transfer was processed," she said. "Not as junior as Mr. Wallace. He was closer to the senior partners." "He's been on your board for 9 years," Daniel said to the room, to himself partially thinking aloud. He came into Halston's structure through the merger with Coastal Ridge Properties in 2015. Which Coastal Ridge had acquired, Evelyn said. From a holding company that was a direct successor entity to Larimer Bridge. Daniel felt the shape of it lock into place. "He's been inside the company that owns the land," he said, "for 9 years, knowing." "Yes. Does Richard know?" "Not yet," Evelyn said, "but he will." 2 floors below, in a smaller conference room that the federal agents had commandeered with the polite efficiency that was their characteristic mode, Richard Halston was looking at a document he had never seen before. It was a copy of the Larimer Bridge Holdings Incorporation filing. Agent Holloway had placed it on the table in front of him 20 minutes into their conversation, and he had not looked away from it since. "I don't recognize this entity," he said. "We know," Holloway said. "Larimer Bridge was dissolved in 1991. By the time Coastal Ridge acquired its successor assets, the trail was cold enough that standard due diligence wouldn't have found it." "But someone knew," Richard said. He wasn't asking, he was thinking aloud, following the logic of it the way you follow a fault line in stone, tracing where the crack runs beneath the surface. "We believe so," Holloway said. "We're looking at several individuals currently or previously connected to your company who had prior knowledge of the original transaction." Richard looked up from the document. "Who?" Holloway paused, a measured, deliberate pause. "Mr. Halston, I want to be careful here about what I share before we've had the opportunity to—" "Gerard Foss," Richard said. Holloway's expression held. "What makes you say that?" "Because Gerard came in through the Coastal Ridge merger," Richard said. "And he was the one who pushed hardest for the Grayfield development to move forward this year. He said the timing was ideal. He said the market conditions were perfect." He set the document down. "He wanted this deal closed." "Why would that matter?" Holloway asked, and by the way she asked it, carefully, like someone holding a door open, Richard understood that she already knew and was seeing whether he would arrive at it himself. He thought for a moment. "If the acquisition closed," he said slowly, "and the property changed hands again, through a legitimate, well-documented transaction with full board approval, publicly announced, it would have created another layer between the land's current state and its original history. The chain of title would have been extended. I'd made harder to challenge." "That's our assessment as well," Holloway said. The room was quiet for a moment. "He was going to use my company," Richard said. "My deal, to bury it further." "We believe that was the intent, yes." Richard sat very still. The feeling moving through him was not simple. It had too many elements for that, layered in a way that would take time to separate. There was anger. There was the particular sickening quality of betrayal, not from an enemy, but from someone he had trusted, sat across from in meetings for 9 years, made decisions with. There was the larger, older guilt that Evelyn had placed in him upstairs, the weight of an empire built on a foundation he hadn't chosen and hadn't examined, all of it at once. "I want to cooperate fully," he said. "Whatever you need, documents, testimony. See access to our systems, all of it." "We'd like to begin with your board records," Holloway said, "and we'll need to speak with Mr. Foss." "He's in the building," Richard said. He reached for his phone. "I'll have him brought up." Upstairs, Daniel was sitting across from Evelyn Carter with his tablet and her legal pad between them, and they were building a timeline. Not for themselves. Evelyn had the timeline in her head as completely as she had the reverter clause. They were building it for the investigators, organizing it in the sequence that would be most useful for legal purposes. Chronological, sourced, each claim tied to a document that existed and could be retrieved. Daniel had been in this kind of work for 6 years, and he had never built a timeline like this one. Not because it was more complex than others he'd handled, though it was, but because of the woman sitting across from him. Every time he named a date or a document, she confirmed it or corrected it from memory. Every connection he found in the archive, she had already found independently through her own 31 years of careful, painstaking research. She had built this case with her own hands, in her own time, largely alone. "The 1986 memo," she said, sliding a photocopied page from her folder across the table. "This was from a senior partner at Pierce & Holloway to Philip Crane. It was misfiled in the county's commercial records archive. Probably by accident. Probably in 1991 when Larimer Bridge was being dissolved. I found it in 2009. Daniel picked it up. It was a short memo, half a page. The language was oblique, careful. The kind of language that powerful people use when they want to convey something without technically saying it. But what it conveyed, once you understood the context, was clear enough. A request to ensure that the Carter Holdings transfer proceed on the established timeline, regardless of any outstanding covenant issues. "This is the smoking gun," Daniel said. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it the way you name something when you've been looking for it and now it's in front of you. "One of them," Evelyn said. "There are others." She reached into her folder and produced 3 more pages, each one another piece. A bank communication, a handwritten note, a signed authorization that bore the name of a man who had, by 1991, become a federal judge and died in 2003. Daniel looked at the documents. He thought about the network behind them, the coordination required to execute something like this, the people who had to agree, who had to participate, who had to stay quiet afterward. Some of them were dead now. Some of them were in this building. "You've been carrying these for years," he said. "The originals are in a safe deposit box," Evelyn said. "Have been since 1994. These are copies." She paused. "I made the originals available to Agent Holloway 14 months ago when the federal case was reopened." "And you kept copies?" "I always kept copies," she said, "of everything." He looked at her. "You planned for the possibility that even the federal case might not be enough." "I planned for every possibility," she said simply. "When you spend 30 years building something, you don't leave contingencies unaddressed." Daniel nodded slowly. He set down the memo and looked at the window. The afternoon was beginning to move into early evening. The light through the glass had shifted, the city below settling into its later rhythms. The day had lasted longer than any other day he could remember. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. "And you don't have to answer it." Evelyn looked at him. "The call this morning," he said. "The person on the other end of the phone, Richard asked you, and you said he was the one person who couldn't be ignored anymore. And then the federal agents arrived, and I've been..." He paused. "I've been trying to understand how the case got reopened. Who had the standing and the authority to make that happen on a dormant 1989 case?" He looked at her directly. "The person on the phone," he said. "Is it your son?" Evelyn Carter looked at Daniel Archer for a long moment. And then, for the first time in this entire building, on this entire day that had begun with a boardroom full of laughter and ended with federal agents moving through the corridors of a 42-floor tower, Evelyn Carter smiled. It was a small smile, brief. But it was the realest thing that had happened in this room all day, and it carried in it something enormous. Pride and love, and the particular deep satisfaction of a mother who has watched her child become something that the world told them they could never be. "His name is Marcus," she said. "He was 6 years old when we acquired the Grayfield land. He grew up watching what was done to us." She paused. "He decided early that he was going to spend his life making sure that what was done to us could not be done to other people." "What does he do?" Daniel asked. "He is the Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States," she said. The room was very quiet. "He has been positioned on this case for 14 months, she continued. "He recused himself from the formal investigation, ethically required, given his personal connection. But he identified the right people to handle it, ensured it was properly resourced, and made certain that when the moment came, when the land moved, when the window opened, the case would be ready." She looked at Daniel steadily. "When I called him this morning," she said, "it was not to ask for help. It was to tell him that the moment had arrived, that I was standing in the room, and that it was time." Daniel held this in his mind, the image of it. This woman in this worn coat with this battered phone, standing at the end of a table full of people who were laughing at her, calling a number from memory. And the voice that answered, her son, the one who had grown up watching, the one who had spent his entire career building toward the day his mother walked into that room. "He asked for you at 7 this morning," Evelyn said. "Before I came here, he said—" She paused. Something moved through her face, brief and deep. "He said, 'Mom, today is the day. Are you ready?'" She looked at the window. "I told him I had been ready for 31 years, she said. The door of the boardroom opened. Agent Holloway stood in the doorway, her expression composed and purposeful. She looked at Evelyn, then at Daniel, then at the documents spread between them on the table. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "we're ready for you." Evelyn rose from her chair. She gathered her folder, placed it carefully under her arm, and picked up her cloth bag. She stood for a moment, straight and still, the way she had stood when she first walked into this room, as if every room she entered was one she had decided to enter, with full knowledge of what she was walking into. She looked at Daniel. "The timeline," she said. "Make sure it's clean, every source cited, every date verified." "I'll have it done," he said. She nodded once. Then she walked to the door, and Agent Holloway stepped aside. And Evelyn Carter moved through it with the same unhurried deliberateness with which she had moved through every door she had walked through today, like a woman who had been building toward this threshold for 3 decades and was finally exactly where she had always intended to be. By early afternoon, the 42nd floor of Halston Tower had become something it had never been designed to be. A place where the architecture of power was coming apart in quiet rooms, one conversation at a time. The news had leaked by noon. Not through any single source, but the way these things always leak. Through a paralegal who texted a friend, through a Meridian Capital associate who called his firm's general counsel. Through the particular atmospheric pressure of a building where too many people knew something was happening, and not enough of them knew exactly what. By 12:30, the first financial news alert had gone out. Halston Development Group under federal inquiry. Grayfield acquisition halted. By 1 o'clock, the company's stock had dropped 11%, and the phones in the communications office 3 floors below had stopped ringing, only because the staff had stopped answering them. In the boardroom, executives who had laughed at an old woman 2 hours earlier were now calling their personal lawyers. Gary sat at the table with both hands flat in front of him, staring at his phone screen with the expression of a man watching something he built slide into the water. Brett was in the corridor, speaking in a low, unfast voice to someone on the other end of his own phone, his hand pressed to his forehead. Two of the junior executives had simply left, gathered their things, and gotten into the elevator without telling anyone, which told its own story about where their loyalties ended. Gerard Foss was escorted to the conference room on the 40th floor at 1:15 p.m. He was a compact man in his early 60s, gray-haired, with the polished composure of someone who had spent decades in rooms where composure was currency. He walked with Holloway's junior agent without appearing rushed, without apparent alarm, and he sat across from Holloway with his hands folded on the table in a posture that suggested he had done nothing wrong and was prepared to say so at length. He lasted 22 minutes. Holloway placed the Larimer Bridge Incorporation document on the table, then the Eastmere filing, then a printed screenshot of the shared investment vehicle that linked Philip Crane to Thomas Birch, then a document Daniel had found 40 minutes earlier, a personal correspondence between Philip Crane and Gerard Foss, dated March 1987, in which Crane had referenced the Carter Holdings matter using a language that made the nature of his involvement unmistakable. Daniel had found it in an archive of Pierce and Holloway's dissolved firm records digitized by the State Bar Association in 2019. It had been sitting there for 7 years, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking for. At the sight of that last document, the composure left Gerard Foss's face the way water leaves a cracked glass. Not all at once, but steadily. And then, all at once, he asked for his lawyer. Holloway nodded and slid a phone across the table. Richard Halston was in his office when Marcus Carter walked off the elevator. He didn't know who Marcus was, not by sight. What he saw, when he looked up through the glass wall of his office, was a man in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, moving through the corridor with the particular ease of someone who understood exactly what kind of room he was walking into and had no uncertainty about his right to be in it. He wore a charcoal suit and carried nothing in his hands. Two people from his team followed at a measured distance behind him. Patricia was out of her chair before he reached the office door. "Sir, I'll need to ask who—" "My name is Marcus Carter," he said. His voice was calm and deep and unhurried. "I'm here to see Mrs. Evelyn Carter. I believe she's with your federal investigators." Patricia looked at him. Then she looked past him, at the two people behind him, at the credentials one of them had already produced and was holding at a professionally unobtrusive angle. "One moment," she said, and reached for her phone. Richard had come to his office door. He and Marcus Carter looked at each other across the corridor. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Richard was looking at a man who was the age Marcus would have been if he had grown up in a thriving company, with a father who was still alive, with a name that hadn't been systematically erased from the public record. Marcus was looking at a man who had run a company built on a foundation he hadn't known was stolen, and who, to his partial credit, he had stopped the bleeding the moment someone showed him where the wound was. "Mr. Carter," Richard said. "Mr. Halston," Marcus said. The words were simple. Everything beneath them was not. "She's 2 doors down," Richard said. "I'll take you." The moment Marcus walked into the room where Evelyn sat with Agent Holloway was not dramatic in the way that climaxes in stories are supposed to be dramatic. There was no music, no speech, no moment staged for an audience. He walked in. She looked up. And something passed between them that had no name in the language of business or law or justice. Something that belonged only to the two of them, to the specific history of a woman who had rebuilt her purpose from the rubble of everything that was taken from her, and the son who had grown up watching her do it and had decided, somewhere in his childhood, that he would spend his life building toward the day she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. He crossed the room and put his arms around her. She held on to him for a moment, just a moment, with her eyes closed. Then she straightened. Her hand smoothed the front of her coat. She was Evelyn Carter again, in full, and the room adjusted itself around her accordingly. "You're late," she said. He smiled. "Traffic." Holloway, who had stepped back to give them the space, caught the eye of her junior agent, and they both looked elsewhere for a polite moment. Marcus turned to Holloway and extended his hand. "I want to be clear that I have no formal role in this investigation," he said. "I recused from all direct involvement 14 months ago. I'm here as her son." "Understood," Holloway said. "And on the record." "On the record?" he confirmed. He pulled a chair and sat beside his mother. "And for the rest of that afternoon, as the investigation moved through its careful, procedural rhythms, as Gerard Foss's lawyer arrived and the interview resumed, as Wallace gave his full statement in a room down the hall, as Daniel delivered his completed timeline document to Holloway's team and was told, quietly, that his cooperation had been noted, Marcus Carter sat next to Evelyn and did not leave her side. Richard found Evelyn alone for 5 minutes near the end of the afternoon, in the corridor outside the room where Holloway's team was processing documents. She was standing near the window, the same window Richard had stood at hours earlier, pressing his hand against the glass, looking down at a city that had looked different then. Now he stopped a few feet from her. She turned to look at him. He had aged in some irreducible way since the morning. Not in his appearance. The suit was still pressed, the posture still upright. But in his face, something had been removed from it. The easy authority, the smooth certainty. What was underneath was more complicated and considerably more human. "Why didn't you come sooner?" he said. He had been sitting with this question all day. If you had the evidence, if the case was building, why wait until today, until this deal, until... "Because you wouldn't have listened," Evelyn said, "not before today." He considered this. He wanted to argue with it. He found he couldn't. "You needed to be in the position of losing something," she said. It wasn't unkind. It was simply accurate. Well, people who have never lost anything significant don't understand what it means when something is taken. Today, you understood. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to be removed from the company." "I know." "The board will vote by the end of the week. Even if the criminal inquiry doesn't extend to me personally, and my lawyers believe it won't, given the circumstances, the association is too much. Shareholders, partners." He paused. "It's done." Evelyn said nothing. "I want to say something to you," Richard said. He straightened slightly, like a man gathering himself for something difficult. Not as a statement for the investigators, not as legal positioning, just directly. She waited. "I am not responsible for what was done to you in 1987, he said, "but I benefited from it. Every year I ran this company, every deal I closed, every award I accepted for building something, it was built on what was taken from you. I didn't know that, but I know it now, and I'm sorry." He said it plainly. No performance in it, no strategy. Just a man standing in a corridor saying the truest thing he had said all day. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. "That's a start," she said. "Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement that something real had been offered, and she had seen it. That the distance between where he had stood this morning and where he was standing now was not nothing, even if it was not yet enough." She turned back to the window. He stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back down the corridor, and the afternoon closed around him, and that was the last conversation they had in that building. 7 months later, the courtroom was full. And not loudly full, not the kind of crowd that comes to watch something explosive. The kind that comes because something true is about to be said in a place where truth is supposed to matter, and people want to be present for that. Journalists in the gallery, lawyers at every table. A judge who had reviewed the case file for 3 weeks before the proceedings began and had asked, in her preliminary notes, how something this thoroughly documented had remained dormant for 35 years. The answer to that question was part of what the proceedings established. Over 19 days of testimony and evidence, the full shape of what had been done to Carter Holdings was laid out in a federal courtroom with the unhurried precision of people who had done the work and were no longer afraid of the size of it, or the forged signatures on the lien filing, the fabricated discharge of the reverter clause, the coordinated withdrawal of financing, the shell companies, the memos, the correspondence that connected Philip Crane, now 81 years old and represented by 3 different lawyers, to a deliberate campaign to dismantle a black-owned enterprise that had grown too large, too successful, and too visible for the comfort of the people around it. Wallace testified for 2 days. He sat in the witness chair with his hands in his lap and spoke in a voice that was steady and careful and full of the particular weight of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and is finally setting it down. He named names. He described documents. He answered every question without deflection. At one point, the opposing counsel asked him why he had said nothing for 35 years, and he said simply that he had told himself the story that allowed him to live with it, and that the story had finally stopped holding. Gerard Foss pleaded guilty on the 14th day. His cooperation agreement required full disclosure of every individual he knew to have been involved in the original scheme. 4 additional names entered the record. 2 were dead. 2 were not. The judgment came on a Thursday morning in late October. The court found in Evelyn Carter's favor on all primary claims. Ownership rights to the Grayfield parcel were formally restored to the estate of Carter Holdings, with Evelyn recognized as its sole surviving principal. Compensatory damages for 35 years of unlawful dispossession were calculated at a figure that the financial press reported with the particular reverence that large numbers command, and that Evelyn received without visible reaction when it was read aloud. She was sitting in the front row of the gallery. Marcus was beside her. Daniel Archer was 2 rows back, in a suit he had bought specifically for the occasion, with his tablet in his bag and his hands folded in his lap. He had been called as a witness on the 4th day of proceedings. His testimony about the reverter clause and the document chain he had reconstructed was part of the evidentiary foundation that made the judgment possible. When the judge's final words settled into the room and the gallery shifted into the murmuring, moving energy of something concluded, Evelyn did not stand immediately. She sat for a moment in the quiet of what had just been said and let it be real. Then she stood. 3 weeks after the judgment, Evelyn stood on the Grayfield land. It was a November morning, cold and gray, with the particular clarity that comes after rain. 1,200 acres of land stretched around her, the same land she had walked with her husband in 1961, when they had signed the deed and stood in the middle of it and talked about what they were going to build. The farmland was still there, the river access, the long, flat sections where the first commercial development had been planned. 63 years later, it looked almost the same. She was not dressed the way she had been dressed in the boardroom. She wore a good coat, dark blue, new, properly fitted, and boots that were made for uneven ground. She looked like what she was, a woman who owned 1,200 acres and had come to stand on them. There were 2 other people with her. Marcus, who stood a few feet to her left with his hands in his coat pockets, looking out at the land with an expression she recognized, the expression he had worn as a child when he was watching something carefully, deciding what he thought about it. And Daniel, who stood a little further back, respectfully, because he understood that this moment belonged primarily to her and was not going to insert himself into it. He had a notepad in his pocket because old habits. "You could rebuild it," Marcus said. He was not pushing. He was opening a door the way he always had, letting her walk through it or not as she chose. Carter Holdings. The name alone? No, she said. Not that. He looked at her. I spent 31 years trying to get back what was taken, she said. That's not the same as building something new. She looked out at the land. The foundation doesn't need to be the same as the one that was destroyed. It just needs to be solid. She had been thinking about this for a long time. Through the proceedings, through the judgment, through the 3 weeks since. What she wanted to build was not a monument to what had been lost. It was something forward-facing. A foundation, literally an organizational foundation that would fund and support black-owned enterprises in commercial real estate. That would provide the legal resources, the financial backing, and the institutional knowledge that Carter Holdings had lacked when the pressure came. But that would make it harder, going forward, for what happened to her to happen to someone else. She had already spoken to 2 lawyers about the structure. She had a name in mind. "Daniel," she said. He stepped forward. "I'm going to need someone who knows how to find things," she said, "and who doesn't stop looking when the looking gets difficult." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm not sure I'm the right person to—" "I'm not asking if you think you're the right person," she said. "I'm telling you that I do." He looked at her, at the land, at Marcus, who gave him the slight, calm nod of a man who has learned that when his mother makes a decision, the sensible response is to find a way to be useful. "All right," Daniel said. She turned back to the land. The wind moved across the long grass in slow, visible waves, and somewhere beyond the far tree line, the river was audible, low and constant and indifferent to everything that had happened in its vicinity across the last 60 years. She stood on the land that had been taken from her and returned to her, and that she was now going to use for something neither she nor her husband had imagined when they first signed their names to a deed in 1961. She stood on it and breathed the cold morning air, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely measure, the uncomplicated solidity of ground beneath her feet. She thought about the boardroom, the laughter, the way Richard Halston had leaned back in his chair and spread his hands and said it with such complete confidence, "Call whoever you want, it won't change a thing." She thought about the phone in her hands, the number she had dialed from memory, the voice that had answered. Mom. Today is the day. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, the land was still there, still hers, and what she was going to do with it was still ahead of her, waiting to be built. "They laughed when I made the call," she said quietly. The wind moved through the grass. They stopped laughing when someone finally answered. "If everything you built was standing on something stolen, would you want to know? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We tell the stories they tried to bury.